Dear learners, in this lecture, we shall be continuing with our discussion on the kinds of companies which can be formed under the company law. I shall be taking up the fourth part of this topic in this lecture. This is an extension of our discussion on the various kinds of business organizations. So, in this part 1, part 2, and part 3 lectures on the kinds of companies, we've looked at how various companies can be different kinds of business organizations suitable to different types of business structures. So, in this part 4, I would be discussing the companies which fall under these two heads: the number of members and size. Here I would be taking up their concepts, features, structure, points of differentiation, along with the provisions governing them under the Companies Act 2013. So firstly, on the basis of number of members, this is the 7th classification we have. Under this classification head, we have 3 companies, namely a public company, private company, and one-person company. To begin with, a public company. A public company is defined under Section 2, Subclause 71 of the Companies Act 2013. According to this provision, a public company means a company which, Part A, is not a private company, and Part B has a minimum paid up share capital as may be prescribed. Now, as you would acknowledge, this is a very technically worded definition which does not reveal much about the meaning and features of a public company. It explains a public company in a reductive or a negative sense by laying down that it is not a private company. Further, the Companies Amendment Act 2015 has removed the requirement of minimum paid up share capital for public companies. This means that a company can be incorporated with such capital as may be decided by the promoters while incorporating the company. Now let us examine the next provision, that is Section 3 Subclause A of the Companies Act 2013 related to a public company. According to this provision, a company may be formed for any lawful purpose by 7 or more members, where the company to be formed is to be a public company. So, a public company has to have a minimum of 7 members, and there is no limit prescribed for the maximum number of members it can have. A public company can be a company that is limited by shares or limited by guarantee or an unlimited company. Now, what is a company limited by shares, company limited by guarantee, or an unlimited company? Refer to our previous discussion on the classification of companies on the basis of liability. A very well-known example of a public company is ITC Limited. Generally, most of the companies that are listed on the stock exchange are public companies. Now, moving on to a private company. A private company is defined under Section 2, Subclause 68 of the Companies Act 2013. According to this provision, a private company means a company having a minimum paid up share capital as may be prescribed, and which by its articles, number 1, restricts the right to transfer its shares, number 2, except in case of one-person company, limits the number of its members to 200. Thirdly, prohibits any invitation to the public to subscribe for any securities of a company. Now, comparing this definition to the definition of a public company, This is a more clear definition and reveals at least three features of a private company. Firstly, that there is a restriction on the number of members or shareholders to transfer their shares. Secondly, this limit is up to 200. So the maximum number of shareholders a private company can have is 200. And thirdly, a private company cannot invite members of the public to purchase the shares of the company. Further, the Companies Amendment Act of 2015 has removed the requirement of minimum paid up capital for private companies. This means that a company can be incorporated with such capital as may be decided by the promoters while incorporating the company. Now let us examine the next provision, that is Section 3 Subclause B of the Companies Act related to a private company. According to this provision, a company may be formed for any lawful purpose by two or more persons where the company to be formed is to be a private company. So, a private company has to have a minimum of 2 members and there is a maximum limit of 200 members. A private company can be a company limited by shares or a company limited by guarantee or unlimited liability depending upon the choice of its promoters or founders. An example of a private company is Google India Private Limited. So generally, after the name of a public company, there is the word limited, denoting that it is a limited liability company. And in case of a private limited company, after the name of the company, we find the words private limited. So in a public company, there is no use of the word private. And in a private limited company, there is use of the word private limited after its name. Now, a private limited company, because it cannot invite members of the public to purchase its shares, so it is not listed on the stock exchange. Then the third kind of a company we have under this classification is a one-person company. Now let us look at it in more detail. A one-person company is defined under Section 2, Subclause 62 of the Companies Act 2013. According to this provision, one-person company means a company which has only one person as a member. Now it means a one-person company can have only a single shareholder. Now let us examine Section 3, Subclause C of the Companies Act 2013 related to a one-person company. According to this provision, a company may be formed for any lawful purpose by one person where the company to be formed is to be a one-person company. So a one-person company can have only a single person as its member or shareholder. A one-person company can be a company limited by shares or a company limited by guarantee or an unlimited company. So while it can have only one person as a member or a shareholder, it can have up to 15 directors. An example of a one-person company is MR Technologies OPC Private Limited. So as the name suggests, that in a one-person company, you would find the words OPC as you find it with MR Technologies Private Limited to distinguish it from a private limited company. Move on to a comparison between a public company and a private company. Now, there are many features on which a public company may be differentiated from a private company. So firstly, on the aspect of limit on membership. A public company does not prescribe any limit or upper limit to the number of shareholders or members it can have, whereas such limit is present in case of a private company, which restricts the total number of shareholders to 200. Second, on the aspect of offer of shares, a public company is open to new shareholders, and the invite that it issues to the members of the public is a general invite. So any member of the public can subscribe the shares of a public company. Whereas it is the other way around in case of a private company. So it is a closed company, and the process of subscription of shares of private company is different from that of a public company, in the sense that there is private placement of shares. So just as there is a difference between what we call as a public place and a private place. So how do you distinguish a place as a public place or a private place? So in a public place, obviously any member of the public, by following the due procedure or rules, they can get access to that place. So for example, public parks or a railway station. So if you buy a platform ticket or if you buy the ticket of a park, then you can access the place. But in case of, let's say, your private garden, obviously there is going to be a restricted access. So same is the case with a private company. So there is a restriction on who can become members of a private company. So the promoters tend to exercise a greater degree of control as to who can become members of a private company. So insofar as the membership of a public company is concerned, there is very little to no regulation, whereas in case of a private company, there is a strong regulation by the promoters of the company. The ownership of a public company is generally very dispersed and distributed to a large group of people, whereas in case of a private company, it is concentrated in a few hands. Insofar as the funding of a public company is concerned, it is funded by the members of the public. Anybody who is willing to subscribe the securities of a public company do become its funders, whereas in case of a private company, it has only what we call as private investors, and so the funding is not indiscriminate, like anyone cannot become a funder in a private company. Then on listing on the stock exchange, public company is accorded the benefit or an advantage or an option to get it listed on the stock exchange, like the Bombay Stock Exchange or the National Stock Exchange. So they have access to a large number of investors by putting their securities on the stock market. Whereas a private company, there is a legal prohibition that they cannot be listed. So on the issue of transfer of shares, generally the shares of a public company are freely transferable and carry no to very little restrictions on transfer of shares. Whereas in case of a private company, there is generally a share transfer restriction. So shareholders of a private company cannot just transfer their shares to anybody or everybody. They have to generally follow more stringent provisions which are put in by the promoters of the company under the Articles of Association relating to share transfer. Now the rationale of having share transfer restrictions in a private company is understandable. Now, why is it so? Now, supposing that any one of you live in a private flat, you live with a group of two more friends. So there are three of you, three friends who live in a flat. Now, all three of you, you know each other. You are friends with each other. You are conversant with your friends' habits, their timings, their etiquettes, so many things. So there is a degree of familiarity. Now, let us say that one of the friends wants to exit the apartment, and he makes a proposal that I want to exit the apartment, but he does not want the other two friends to bear the financial burden of his exit. So he says that uh, I am going to get a new friend for both of you, and you can share your apartment with that person. Now, if there is a possibility that the two remaining friends in the apartment are not conversant or not familiar with the third person who is proposed to be brought into the apartment. So you don't know about his habits, his schedule, his hygiene, so on and so forth. So don't you think that you should have some right, or you should have some leverage over deciding who that new person is going to come in? So the natural answer to this problem is yes, that you need a degree of regulation as to who is going to stay with you in an apartment. So in the same way, uh, in case of a private company, there are restrictions on the exit of a shareholder and coming in of a shareholder. So a big public company has to go through more stringent regulations under the law as compared to a private company which has got fewer regulations. Now, the investor base of a public company is very wide, naturally, because it has access to a large number of investors from the public. Whereas, in case of a private company, the investor base is generally small or a fewer number of people. Now, the aspect of name suffix I have already explained. In case of a public company, after the name of the company, you will find the word limited, and in case of a private company, you will find the word private limited. Now, with this, we end the comparison or points of differentiation between a public company and a private company. Now, let us analyze in more detail some of the features of a one person company, which is abbreviated as an OPC. Now, an OPC is called a hybrid company as it is a combination of two different kinds of business organizations which are entirely different. That is sole proprietorship and a company. So, we have already undertaken a detailed discussion on both these two kinds of business organizations. So an OPC enables the sole trader or a sole proprietor to enter the corporate world by incorporating their proprietorship in the form of a company under the Companies Act. This enables the sole proprietor to avail of the various benefits of a corporate entity, such as the principle of limited liability and separate legal personality. The next aspect of an OPC is that it encourages entrepreneurship and innovation. Now, the introduction of an OPC in the legal system is a move that encourages corporatization of micro businesses and entrepreneurial ventures. It provides startup entrepreneurs with a new form of business organization over which they have full control. Now, generally, for large public companies or private companies, the degree of control that the promoters have may be less as compared to a sole proprietorship in which there is full control of the proprietor. But in an OPC, the one person who is the member of the company, he has a very vast control over the company in which he is the shareholder, just like a sole proprietor. So incorporation of a OPC by an entrepreneur represents a personal commitment to the business, which is a sole idea of the person and close to his heart. By providing an outlet for the entrepreneurial impulses among the entrepreneurs, an OPC can drive creation of businesses which are innovative and disruptive. So if an entrepreneur has a business idea and that business idea is very new, novel, or even maybe disruptive, and nobody else in the world agrees with his business idea and are not willing to collaborate with him either as a partner or a co-shareholder, then that one person with whom nobody is wanting to collaborate, he can still have a business with the benefit of a corporation by registering his business as an OPC as a single shareholder. Now the third aspect of an OPC is, or rather an advantage, is flexible management. So while an OPC has a singular ownership, but there can be diversified management. An OPC can have from 1 to 15 directors. So if the promoter of an OPC desires to manage the company entirely by oneself, he can be the sole member as well as the director. So this aspect of delegated management that we explained in the core characteristics of a company, which is generally there with some other kinds of companies like private and public company, this greatly gets diminished in case of a one-person company where there could be a conjugation or integration of ownership and management. However, if the promoter of an OPC desires professional, diverse and skilled management, he can appoint up to 15 directors who will constitute a board and will be responsible for carrying out the management of the company and taking its business decisions. Now an OPC also gets certain regulatory relaxations. So an OPC enjoys the benefits of many regulatory and compliance relaxations as compared to some other companies. For example, the annual returns of an OPC, they can be signed by the director of a company if it does not have any company secretary. So apart from the directors, there are certain key managerial personnel of a company like company secretary, CFO, COO, so on and so forth. So many of the responsibilities of the key managerial personnel, they could be taken by the limited number of persons that are associated with an OPC, like its directors. Similarly, the financial statements of an OPC can be signed by the director of a company if it does not have a company secretary. The provisions of the Companies Act relating to holding of general meetings of a company, they do not apply to an OPC as it has only a single member as its shareholder. Now the general meetings, just to briefly introduce you, are meetings between the shareholders on one hand and the board of directors or management on the other hand. So they generally give an opportunity to the shareholders who otherwise do not participate regularly in the day-to-day business decisions of the company to make a performance appraisal of the directors of the company. Because in a company, what happens is that the shareholders give their money to the directors and give them power over the management and over the capital to put that money to good use in the business of the company. And what the shareholders expect is they expect good governance and high returns on their investment. Now, the directors generally enjoy a good degree of autonomy over how to use the capital of the shareholders. So naturally, the shareholders should get a right or an opportunity or a platform to take an appraisal from the directors as to what they have done with their money. So that is usually taken into account in the meetings of a company. Now, because an OPC has got a single member, so the single member, obviously there are no co-shareholders. He's the only single shareholder. So he just has to sign on that paper of like the minutes of the meetings, which would be regarded as holding of the AGM. So there is no requirement of an AGM as such because there is no body of shareholders. Now, in the same way, some other regulatory relaxations of an OPC is that if there is only one director, then obviously no meeting of the board of directors is also required. So these are some of the benefits of a one-person company, which is a very new concept under the various kinds of companies, with the aim of promoting much of the entrepreneurial aspirations and ease of doing business. So obviously there are some similarities which we have between a one-person company and a private company. So here in this slide we will draw up a differentiation between a one-person company and a private company. The differentiation is required because an OPC is a kind of a private company. Why we say that it is a kind of a private company? Because there is a limit on how many number of shareholders it can have. So a public company, on the other hand, there is no limit on the number of shareholders. So in that sense, on the aspect of limited number of shareholders or prescribed number of shareholders, there is a degree of similarity between an OPC and a private company. So in that sense, every OPC is a private company, but every private company is not an OPC. So obviously private company has to have a minimum of 2 members. So it cannot be an OPC that way. Now let us see the differences between these two types of companies. Firstly, on the membership, the number, an OPC has a single shareholder or a member, and a private company from minimum 2 to a maximum of 200. Secondly, on the minimum number of directors, an OPC has to have a minimum of 1 director, whereas a private company has to have a minimum of 2 directors. The compliances or regulatory relaxations are few for an OPC, as we discussed in the previous slide, as compared to a private company, which has to undergo more rigorous compliances as compared to an OPC, but less than a public company. Because the public company, if it is listed on the stock exchange, it has some additional compliances to meet of the stock exchange where it is listed. So a private company in terms of compliance falls in the middle. So public company with highest number of regulations and compliances, then a private company, and least for an OPC. Now, board meetings are required for an OPC only if there are more than 1 director, whereas for a private company, it has to have a mandatory general meetings, at least 4 meetings per year. In an AGM or annual general meeting, that is the meeting of the shareholders, the OPC is not required to conduct an AGM because there is a single shareholder who is not required to meet any of his co-shareholders because none are there. but an AGM is required for a private company because there are at least minimum of 2 shareholders. So as far as the law is concerned, foreign ownership of an OPC is not allowed. Foreign investors, foreign shareholders, but same is allowed for a private company. In terms of funding, it is difficult to get funding in an OPC due to a single ownership. This can be regarded as one of the drawbacks or limitations of an OPC, because many of the venture capitalists or investors who want to make an investment in the new venture, they can insist that they require shareholding of the venture in which they want to make an investment, but that option is not available in an OPC. So an OPC does not have an option to offer shares to its investors. So in that sense, those external investors who are looking to purchase shares of the new business, they would not be able to get the shares in case of an OPC. But in case of a private company, funding becomes easy because it can issue shares to its new shareholders or members. Now there is an option of conversion of an OPC into other kinds of companies like a private company. So if share capital exceeds 50 lakh or turnover exceeds 2 crore, the option of conversion is there. But for a private company, it is not required to convert due to increase in capital or turnover. So if the capital of a OPC exceeds beyond a certain limit, conversion is required from an OPC to a private company, but that is not required in case of a private company, again, which is an kind of an advantage over an OPC. Here we conclude the comparison or a contrast between an OPC and a private company. Now let us move on the classification of a company based on size. This is the 8th classification that we are taking up. In this category, we have two companies, namely a small company and other company. Other company essentially meaning a company other than a small company. Now, taking up a small company first. A small company is defined under Section 2, Subclause 85 of the Companies Act 2013. According to this provision, a small company means a company, firstly, which is not a public company, and secondly, the paid up share capital is equal to or below rupees 4 crore. Thirdly, the turnover is equal to or below rupees 40 crore. So the Companies Act 2013 introduced the concept of small companies to provide advantages for small businesses operating as private limited companies. So small companies have less annual revenue compared to regular sized companies. In a developing economy like ours, small companies play a significant role in generating profits and boosting employment, especially in MSME sector. Thus, they are the backbones of the economy. The primary purpose of a small company is to promote economic development and job creation, while also providing a simplified regulatory environment for businesses with limited resources and turnover as compared to larger corporations. The small company classification under the Companies Act 2013 aims to reduce the compliance burden on smaller businesses, allowing them to focus on core operations and growth. Most startups in India can be classified as small companies as they will not have a paid up share capital of more than rupees 4 crore. and an annual sales turnover of more than rupees 40 crores. So just like an OPC, a small company is also entrepreneurship friendly. Now, one important thing that you have to keep in mind is that a small company is not a public company. So in terms of its structure, it does not define as to what a small company is, except by saying that it should not be a public company. So it can be an OPC or it can be a private limited company. If it is got a single shareholder, then the small company will be an OPC. And if it has got more than one shareholder, then it can be a private limited company. But the essential thing that distinguishes a small company with a private limited company can be the quantum of its share capital or turnover. Then we have the expression of other company. Now this expression is not defined under the Companies Act 2013. Rather, it is used in the context of and in contrast with a small company. Now, it means any company whose share capital or turnover is more than what is prescribed for a small company. So, in terms of the quantum of share capital and its turnover, a company may be small company and other than a small company. Now, there are some exceptions under the law related to small company. So the definition of a small company is not applicable to the following categories. A small company cannot be a holding company or a subsidiary company or a company registered under Section 8 of the Companies Act, that is a company for charitable objects, or a company or body corporate that is governed by any special act which is a statutory company. Thus, even though the above mentioned companies satisfy the capital and turnover requirements of a small company, they would nevertheless fall beyond the purview of small company, and consequently the advantages which are applicable to a small company cannot be extended to them. Now we come to the end of this lecture. Just to summarize it for the benefit of the learners, we have discussed two kinds of classification. Firstly, on the basis of number of members, where we have three kinds of companies, that is public, private and one person company. So this classification focuses on the company structure in terms of the number of its shareholders. So if somebody is looking to get funding from members of the public, generally that is a public company. If a few select group of people want to start a company and want to have a restriction on who can become its members, they will start a private company. And if there is only one person who wants to start the company entirely on his own, he'll be a one-person company. Then on the basis of size, we have small and other than small companies depending upon its share capital and total turnover. With this, we come to an end of this lecture. We will continue with the kinds of companies as business organization in the subsequent upcoming lectures. Thank you.